The horses knew. An hour before the arrows came, before the first muzzle flash split the Arizona dark, before any human ear caught the specific silence that precedes an ambush, the horses knew. They shifted against their picket lines. They stamped. They turned their heads toward the dark brush surrounding the camp at the junction of Turkey Creek and Tuscumbia Creek and communicated, in the only language available to them, that something was wrong. 5 men lay sleeping, 5 men who had ridden 30 miles southeast of Prescott into the rough granite heart of the Bradshaw Mountains looking for gold, had been warned about the Yavapai, had gone out on a twilight scout that turned up nothing, had eaten venison off the fire, and had turned in early to escape the mosquitoes. They did not listen to the horses. It was the last mistake they had the luxury of making. 1 hour before dawn on June 2nd, 1864, the Yavapai came out of the dark. Not a handful of raiders, not the small, opportunistic war party that the 5 prospectors had calculated they could handle. Frank Binkley, Samuel Herron, Stuart Wall, Fred Henry, and D.M. Scott. All veterans of frontier fighting, all confident in their firepower and their experience. The force that hit the camp at Turkey Creek that morning numbered between 30 and 50 warriors. They had been following the prospectors from Walnut Creek, tracking them, watching them make camp, waiting for the specific vulnerability of the pre-dawn hours, when the body's temperature is lowest and sleep is deepest, and a man takes 2 full seconds to understand what has woken him. The first sound was the arrows. A barrage of them, not a single shaft loosed in warning, but a sustained, coordinated volley that filled the air above the bedrolls with the dry whisper of fletched shafts moving fast through still air. Men were on their feet before they were fully conscious. One grabbed the nearest rifle. It was wet. The Arizona night had put moisture into the action. The cap seated, the hammer fell, and nothing happened. A flat, dead click in the dark, where there should have been fire and thunder. He dropped it and drew his revolver. The fight was on. What those 5 men were carrying into that fight deserves examination, because the physical record of their armament tells you exactly what kind of men they were and exactly how desperate the morning was about to become. Every man in the party carried a rifle and a pair of Colt revolvers, cap and ball weapons, not the cartridge revolvers that would standardize frontier armament in the years ahead, but the proven, powerful percussion instruments of the Civil War era. The Colt Point .44 caliber round ball, backed by 40 grains of black powder, delivered a heavy, slow projectile with significant stopping power at close range. Loading one took time. Powder measured and poured, ball seated and rammed, cap pressed onto the nipple. But each man carried 2, giving him 12 rounds of revolver fire before he needed to reload anything. Fred Henry's primary long arm was a Hawken rifle, a .53 caliber plains rifle, firing a round ball that weighed 32 to the pound. The Hawken was the weapon of the Mountain Man era, built in St. Louis, carried across the Rockies, used by the fur trappers and scouts of the 1820s and 30s. That one was still in active service on an Arizona frontier in 1864 is a detail that locates these men precisely in the transitional moment of American frontier history. 1 foot in the buckskin past and 1 in the percussion present. Stuart Wall carried a Harper's Ferry rifle, percussion lock, same caliber, charged with 70 grains of black powder behind the ball. 70 grains was a heavy load. It drove the projectile out of the barrel at a documented muzzle velocity of at least 1,700 feet per second, producing a recoil that a man could feel in his back teeth and a report that in the confined granite draw of Turkey Creek would have been physically painful to anyone standing within 20 feet of the muzzle. At least 1 double-barreled shotgun was in the group. Loaded with buckshot at the ranges this fight would be conducted, close enough to smell the powder smoke on both sides, it was the most immediately devastating weapon on the flat. The problem was time. Loading any of these weapons under fire, in the dark, with hands that were shaking from cold and adrenaline and the specific physical shock of having just been hit by an arrow or a bullet, required a discipline of movement that no amount of experience fully prepares a man for. Powder horn uncapped, charge measured by feel, ball withdrawn from the pouch, Ramrod drawn, seated, driven home. Cap extracted from the tin, seated on the nipple. Hammer to full cock. 30 seconds, perhaps 40. In a sustained firefight against 50 warriors who were themselves armed with rifles, bows, and rocks, 40 seconds was a very long time to be reloading. Upbeat, fast-building intensity. By the time the eastern hills began to show gray, 4 of the 5 men were bleeding. A bullet had entered Frank Binkley's face at the nose and exited through his eye socket, taking the eye with it. He lay still in the brush, presumed dead by both sides. Wall had a bullet through the body, not a graze, a through-and-through wound that was bleeding steadily and stealing from him, minute by minute, the physical strength needed to hold a rifle to his shoulder. Henry was hit in the arm and in the breast. Scott's hand was crippled. 2 horses were dead. A third moved around the flat with arrows in it, making a sound that everyone who has ever heard a horse in serious pain will tell you is unlike anything else on earth, higher than it should be, more sustained, more human in its register than any animal noise has the right to be. Only Heron was unwounded, and Heron, in the specific calculus of that morning, was everything. The men worked while they bled. They dug with sheath knives and a small shovel, throwing up whatever dirt they could scrape from the rocky ground. They piled saddles, supply packs, and rocks into a rough barricade and fired from behind it, while the Yavapai pressed from multiple directions simultaneously, using the terrain with the fluid expertise of people who had been fighting in these mountains since before any American survey had given them a name. Wall went down, not from a new wound, from the accumulated weight of the one he already had. He could no longer hold his rifle upright. He called to Henry below him on the slope to come up. Henry came, but as he moved up the ravine, the Yavapais saw his weakness and rushed him, a fast, committed charge by warriors who understood that a man who cannot run cannot fight. Henry drew both Colts. He drove them back. The physical record of that moment, 2 cap-and-ball revolvers against a rush of warriors in an Arizona ravine, exists only in the testimony of the men who survived it, but it carries the unmistakable texture of truth. 70 yards up the draw, Heron stopped moving. He had taken nothing in the early fighting. He was the strongest man left standing. And somewhere between the camp and the juniper tree that stood at the top of the draw, whatever reserve he had been spending all morning ran out entirely. He sat down in the dirt and told his companions to leave him. Save themselves. Go. They refused. All of them. 4 wounded men, 1 of them missing an eye, 1 unable to raise his rifle, 1 with a crippled hand, chose to die beside the unwounded man who had given out rather than leave him in the Bradshaw Mountains alone. They set up under the juniper. They watched from its shade as the Yavapai descended on the abandoned camp 400 yards below, gathering the supplies, the equipment, the remaining horses, cutting the dead animals apart with methodical efficiency and building fires to roast the meat. The smell of wood smoke and cooking horseflesh drifted up the draw to where the 5 men sat and waited and counted their remaining ammunition and said whatever men say to each other when they have privately accepted that this is the place. At 11 in the morning, Henry and Binkley moved, crawling first, then walking, trying 3 different directions before finding one the Yavapai had not yet covered. In a ravine, moving low and quiet through the brush, a warrior rose from the ground directly behind them. He spoke, in Spanish first, then in English. "Where are you going, friends?" Henry pointed silently in one direction, then walked the other. The warrior watched them go. Who he was and why he made that choice, and what calculation or mercy or simple human curiosity moved him to let 2 broken men walk away through the Arizona scrub, the historical record does not say. It records only the fact. The warrior rose. He spoke. He let them pass. Some evidence is complete in itself and requires no interpretation. Henry and Binkley walked through the night, all of it, on wounds that had been bleeding since before dawn, across 30 miles of rough Arizona territory, on feet that had not been designed for this specific task by any reasonable measure of human endurance. They reached Walnut Grove at 8 in the morning. Jack Swilling, scout, frontiersman, and the man who would later channel the Salt River and found the settlement that became Phoenix, Arizona, left with 10 men within minutes of the alarm. They rode hard. They arrived at Battle Flat by 2 in the afternoon. The Yavapai were gone. The fires had burned down to ash. The bones of the horses lay scattered across the flat in the specific pattern of a hasty but thorough butchering. And under the juniper tree, in the shade it had provided all through the long-burning Arizona afternoon, 3 men were still alive. Heron was not conscious. He had not been since sometime in the middle of the day. They carried him back to Walnut Creek, and he held on for 9 days with the specific, unreasonable stubbornness of a man who had refused to be left behind, even when leaving was the rational choice. He died on the 9th day. He was buried at Walnut Grove. The rescuers counted 14 Yavapai dead on the field. The location was entered on whatever maps existed of that corner of Arizona territory as Battle Flat. It has been called that ever since. Stuart Wall survived 14 wounds and went home to San Bernardino, where he became the city's first marshal and lived to old age. D.M. Scott recovered the use of his hand and hid it rich in the mountains that had nearly killed him. Fred Henry stayed in Arizona and died in Bisbee in 1899, in a bed, which by any measure of probability was not what the dawn of June 2, 1864 had promised him. Frank Binkley went back to San Bernardino with one eye. He returned to Arizona. He fought the same band of Yavapai later that year at Skull Valley, where 40 warriors were killed. He told people afterward that he felt the accounting had been settled, that the eye had been answered for. Whether the warrior who let him walk out of the ravine was among the dead at Skull Valley, history does not record. Whether Binkley thought about him in the years that followed, in the specific, unresolvable way that men think about the people who chose not to kill them, history does not record that either. Some debts are paid in blood, some are paid in silence. The Bradshaw Mountains collected both, and the juniper tree kept the only record that mattered, the shade it gave to men who had no right to still be breathing, and the fact that when Swilling arrived, they were.